Hello, just thrilled to have Chris Stark with me here, professor of composition from Washington University in St. Louis. Chris, we've known each other for quite some time. I've been doing your pieces now for, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 years, and it's really been so nice to watch your work unfold. And it seems to me that you have steered more towards finding inspiration in the natural world from the environment. And I want you to talk a little bit about this piece, but I want to tee it up a little bit. A lot of your work does involve electronics, and this piece, like many others, tries to pit this natural world against a synthetic world. And the piece is a beautiful sort of sonic landscape that evokes perhaps water or waterfalls or rivers or a pastoral mountain scenery in a way. And in fact, the audience might feel a little bit tricked because as the group enters the hall, you hear clapping. And, since we're in COVID, there's no audience here. So the clapping is manufactured. But the clapping transitions into what could be heard as a waterfall. And then the piece begins. And the electronics are looping and over looping some of the material from the four trumpets or the strings. So maybe I gave it all away. Give us some more.
No, that's great. There's nothing to hide there. I mean, of course, when there is an audience, it's kind of fun, and the idea did grow out of trying to bring a little wonder into the experience of the concert hall with the technology, and having some kind of connection between the audience, the sound the audience makes, which is actually a very rich noise source, not unlike running water or a waterfall or something like that, when they applaud, and sampling that and looping that to turn it into something that sounds not like an audience, but actually sounds, yeah, like a waterfall or something like that, which is then filtered and taken up by the ensemble. And you pretty much nailed it. I'm totally interested in this idea of the synthetic and the natural, and how these two things can interact, and where the threshold is between the two of them. I'm also, I'm from Western Montana. I grew up at the base of the mountains and on a giant lake called Flathead Lake, and I spent a lot of time in nature. I still try to whenever I can, but that's a huge part of my inspiration when I'm writing. And in recent years, that's changed a lot. It started as something that was just part of my childhood, and now that we're fully into this realm of the Anthropocene, it's a totally different inspiration, and that it feels more urgent and it feels more important to talk about nature and how beautiful it is, and try to represent that with music. The other thing is, though, is that I use a lot of technology, um, because that's sort of how I got my start in music. Again, the strangest thing about growing up in the middle of nowhere in Montana is that you have almost no access to real musicians, and so everything I encountered was through recordings. And I got a Macintosh computer in the I think we started. My dad purchased one in like the '80s or something like that, and we had dial-up internet access in the '90s, and that was where I found out. That's where I taught myself music, through software and through guitar tablature and other sorts of things, until I could get to university and actually take theory classes and learn this kind of stuff. But so that's kind of my native tongue in a way, is the computer. And so for a long time I kind of rejected it and wrote only acoustic music, thinking that that was a more serious art form. But slowly I've realized that that's really a part of my how I express myself and the emotional landscape of my work. And I find I can be more connected actually through using technology and mixing it in with the acoustic musicians.
Well, and you blend the two worlds really beautifully. And this idea of the synthetic and the natural is really compelling. So, you talk about how you've turned more towards um, pieces that are inspired or try to draw on nature. Is this in some ways I don't want to say political idea, but does it come from the overwhelming issue of environmentalism and what we're facing today as a people.
Definitely. Absolutely. And that is, yeah, 100% true. And also, interestingly, the use of samples also comes from a desire to want to be more political in my work. Uh, you may notice if you attend, any contemporary art exhibitions, photography exhibitions, films, they're all engaged with politics in a very concrete and sort of like obvious way. And music attempts to do that, but because music or instrumental music is abstract, it has a very hard time engaging with a lot of politics unless you do it in an incredibly overt way. And I found myself wanting to engage more with politics in my work. And one of the ways I found that I could do that is by actually using samples, which brings in a concrete element to a work. So using something that sounds, or using the sound of running water, using the sound of wind, using these kinds of samples in my work has a direct correlation to the audience, to something that is nature or is natural. And I think that's for me also an attempt to be more overtly political as a sort of activist or something, if you want to call it that.
It's interesting we bring this up because I was just reading a quote, and I think it's apt here to bring this in. You'll just forgive me. I'm going to bring it up here.
Sure.
You can see that I'm searching my screen.
I'll add one other thing real quick. Another fascinating thing, and I mentioned this in the rehearsal the other day, when I use samples, I'm always surprised at how intensely they become recontextualized from performance to performance. So I had no idea when I wrote this piece, which happened last year in LA, this idea that the connection from the audience making sound in Disney Hall, which is this incredibly beautiful space with a big audience, and it was a really rich sound source to translate and sample into the instrumental music at the beginning of this piece. I had no idea a year later there would be no audiences. And so playing back that sample now has this eerie, weird quality that we're not allowed to be in concert halls right now. And who knew there would be a pandemic in a year? And so that sample means something completely different now than it did when I wrote this piece a year ago. And that's happened with other samples I've used. For example, of like running water. When you play a piece in Arizona with sounds of running water, or you play that same piece in Seattle with sounds of running water, they mean completely different things to the audience that is there experiencing that.
Of course, you think about the book Cadillac Desert from like the 70s or 80s. I mean, water means different things depending on where you live. Water is identifying from a sense of location and what it means to us. Yeah, you're absolutely right. If you live in Arizona or Seattle, water is a different thing altogether. So I love this idea of being political with your artistic expression, and as such, there's this great quote here. Here it is. It's from John Luther Adams, and I think this is true that more often than not, political art fails as politics, and all too often it fails as art. To reach its fullest power, to be most moving and most fully useful to us, art must be itself. All of the best extra musical justifications or poetic program notes mean nothing unless the art succeeds in and of itself. And I think for your piece, that's abundantly the case. It's a beautiful piece. It's so wonderful to experience and listen to. But yet there is this clear message that it's a little hard to miss in a way.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I completely agree with him. I think having a concrete political guide oftentimes will fail if you're not really attached to the musical material and trying to get the musical material to function on its own outside of politics. But I think we all have to make music from an impetus, from some sort of emotional impetus or intellectual impetus or something.
Well, Chris, as always, it's such a pleasure doing your work, and thank you so much for your music.
Thank you. It was fantastic to hear the ensemble in rehearsal. I think it was the first rehearsal I've had since this pandemic started, so it was really moving, and your group sounds fantastic. And thank you so much for programming this piece.